Hi everybody and welcome to Biodiversity and Sustainability. Today we're going to be talking a bit more about ecosystems and giving an example of Yellowstone's wolves. This should be a relatively short lecture, but it's important nonetheless. Okay, so let's get started. I'll just start showing my screen. Here we go. Okay, so by the end of this class you guys should be able to define an ecosystem and explain how components of an ecosystem are connected. 2, understand that there is diversity in ecosystem types. And 3, define ecosystem functions and why they are important. Just before I go any further, I'm going to change my pointer to the little laser. There we go. Okay. So, let's think very quickly about levels of organisation. So early on in this class we talked about the organisation of organisms, and we talked about how there are molecules combine together to form cells, groups of cells form together to produce like nervous tissue, brains, nervous systems and organs, and these organs all group together to make organisms, which is the entire living thing. Remember, we talked about this whole idea when we did the section on a genetic diversity. But this whole process doesn't stop here. So we can go a bit further on. So here's our organism, where we finished up on the last slide. Well, groups of organisms combine together to form populations. So these are a group of organisms of one type that live in the same area. That's the crucial bit, one type and the same area. Populations can be grouped together to form a community, where a community is populations of lots of different species living in the same place. Communities form part of ecosystems. So an ecosystem is the community and its non-living surroundings and the ecosystem functions. And we can go even higher up to the biosphere, which is the earth. The part of the earth contains all the ecosystems. If we wanted to, we could really keep on going, I suppose, and we could go from the biosphere to the planet, which is the part of the earth contains all the ecosystems, and also the atmosphere and the Earth's core and all the processes that control volcanoes and tectonic plates. If we wanted to, we'd go even higher and say, well, now we're into the solar system, which is the system that contains the Earth and all the other planets that orbit the Sun. We could go even higher and say, well, let's go into the galaxy when our solar system sits inside the galaxy, to the universe, and so on and so forth. So these orders of complexity are quite broad. But today we're going to be focusing on ecosystem. And so remember, an ecosystem, it's the community of animals and plants and fungi and bacteria, and also the non-living surroundings, especially the processes. Okay. Now ecosystems come in very, very diverse types. So we have things like tropical rainforests, which we think of as being very, very biodiverse indeed. Huge plant diversity, huge insect diversity, and lots of other animals. We also have deserts, which are a lot less diverse. They have much lower plant diversity, much lower biomass, but they're still ecosystems. Then we have things like Bear Lake, we've got grasslands, rivers and the riparian vegetation, coral reefs, mountainous alpine ecosystems, and even some truly crazy ones like these are hydrothermal vents that exist on the deepest bottom of the ocean. We're going to talk very briefly about hydrothermal vents. Has anyone ever heard of hydrothermal vents before? If you have, give yourself a pat on the back. They are one of the most incredible ecosystems on the planet. So hydrothermal vents were only really discovered and came to prominence when I was an undergrad in the 90s. Prior to the 90s, we didn't really think about hydrothermal vents at all. And hydrothermal vents are these amazing deep sea ecosystems where this is the very bottom of the ocean, this is the vent itself, and what it's doing is it's blasting chemicals and heat into the water from the Earth's core. These hydrothermal systems, the temperature down there can be insanely high. So the water can often be well over boiling point, well over 100 degrees Celsius, sometimes up to nearly 200 degrees Celsius. You might wonder, well, why on earth does this water not boil? And the reason the water doesn't boil is because you're at the very bottom of the ocean, So the pressure is insane. And so because the pressure is so high, it keeps the water from boiling. And these hydrothermal vents, these things are called black smokers as a nickname. They're shooting out heat and various what can be toxic chemicals to us. But an entire ecosystem has grown up around these hydrothermal vents. And in this one, for example, these are all a whole suite of different worms. And then there's crabs and the specific fish. There's a whole ecosystem that goes up around this. And what's crazy about these ecosystems is they're one of the few ecosystems on the planet that do not rely on photosynthesis to get their energy. All other ecosystems, such as tropical rainforests, the energy that fuels these ecosystems is derived from photosynthesis taking place in the plants, which is converting the sun's sunlight with CO2 and water to produce energy. Same is true in desert ecosystems. It's the green on the plants that harnesses the energy from the sun to convert it into living tissue. Same with these grasslands. Same with the phytoplankton in Bear Lake. Same with coral reefs. Same with these. The one that doesn't do it is hydrothermal vents. Instead of being based on photosynthesis, these are based on what they call chemosynthesis. And if you look at these worms, the red in their colour, the red in their tissue, is actually a type of bacteria that lives inside the tissue of an awful lot of species on these hydrothermal vents. And that bacteria is able to convert the heat and the chemicals from these black smokers into energy. And that fuels this entire ecosystem. What that means is at the base of the ocean are these ecosystems that live totally independently of the sun. It's a crazy system. If you get a few minutes, go on YouTube and just look up some videos and stories about hydrothermal vents in the ocean. They are absolutely incredible. And to say they're one of the most unique ecosystems because one of the only ecosystems on the planet who its energy is not generated by the sun's energy. Okay? So that's just a cool little aside. So let's talk very quickly about ecosystem functions. So ecosystem functions are described as the collective outcomes of biotic and abiotic processes and their interactions. So examples of ecosystem functions are things like primary production. Primary production is plants photosynthesizing and sequestering the sun's energy and turning it into living tissue, like plants. Other examples are production of animal biomass. So how much animal biomass can an ecosystem produce? We can also talk about energy flux. That is the rates of transfer of energy between animals and plants, or predators and prey. We can also talk about nutrient cycling, how carbon, nitrogen and phosphorus are moved around amongst different species of animals and plants. And we also talk about carbon storage. So carbon storage is a sequestration of carbon out of the atmosphere by plants and then putting that carbon into the soil or other long-term pools. So let's just have an example of it. So here is our ecosystem, and each one of these arrows represents a different ecosystem function. Ecologists, especially ecosystem ecologists, they love these arrow diagrams because these arrows represent ecosystem functions. And the critical thing about ecosystem functions is they are described as rates. So they're the rates at which things happen. For example, let's have a look here. We've got here a plant, and here is it getting eaten by a rabbit. So this arrow indicates the rate of protein, energy and nutrient transfer between the plant and the rabbit. The rabbit, because it's a rabbit, it poops, it excretes, and eventually it dies. And so what we do is we put another arrow to denote the decaying organic matter coming from the rabbit going into the soil. This decaying organic matter, it goes through a rate, it then becomes free nitrates, nitrites and ammonia due to the bacterial processes. These nitrogenous compounds, due to denitrifying bacteria, they can be turned back, and that's the sequestering of nitrogen. These denitrifying bacteria, they release nitrogen into the atmosphere, another rate. And so we've got all of these denoting rates and processes. Okay. And these ecosystem functions are good because they provide a measure of the overall condition and properties of an ecosystem. Instead of just measuring, oh, how is one species doing, what we can do is we can measure rates of these ecosystem functions, and it tells us how healthy the entire ecosystem is. And think of this a bit like if you go to the doctor. So if you go to the doctor when they do a health assessment on you, what they do is they measure rates. So they measure the rate of your heartbeat, they measure your blood pressure, they measure cholesterol, and they often look at the rates of change of these. So they're measuring rates of processes and functions that your body performs. When we're doing it for ecosystems, instead we can use rates such as plant production. How fast does an ecosystem produce a certain amount of plant biomass? How quickly do plants grow in this ecosystem? We can also look at things like nutrient cycling. Is the ecosystem functioning well in regards to moving nitrogen amongst the soil, plants and animals? We can also look at rates of carbon storage. Are these plants growing fast enough that they're sequestering CO2 out of the atmosphere and converting it into soils? So these rates we can use to measure an overall property of the ecosystem, and it's great because we're not having to measure the populations of every single species, and we can use differences in these rates to directly compare ecosystems. We can have a look at how good are tropical rainforests at plant production compared to deserts. We can ask these sort of questions, and it's a great way of comparing ecosystems. So let's have a quick thought exercise. Remember, ecosystem functions have to be rates, that's critical. But this is a fake clicker question. Which of these is not an ecosystem function? So not an ecosystem function. The amount of nutrients flowing from a farmer's field into a wetland, the amount of nutrients flowing out of the wetland, the amount of bird habitat that the wetland contains, the amount of CO2 the wetland takes out of the atmosphere, or the amount of fish the wetland produces. So which of these is not an ecosystem function? Just give you 10 seconds on this. Okay, well, the correct answer in this case is actually A. The amount of nutrients flowing from a farmer's field into a wetland is not necessarily an ecosystem function. It's more likely to be due to the amount of nutrients as fertilizer the farmer is putting onto the field in the first place. However, the amount of nutrients flowing out of the wetland, that is an ecosystem function because the wetland is processing those nutrients, taking them up, redistributing them amongst different pools in the ecosystem, and so the amount coming out is then a function of how well the wetland ecosystem is performing. The amount of bird habitat a wetland contains, that is a function of the ecosystem. How well do the plants in the ecosystem provide habitat for birds? The amount of CO2 the wetland takes out of the atmosphere, this is carbon storage, again, that is an ecosystem function. And the amount of fish the wetland produces, again, this is a rate, it's the amount of fish biomass produced by the ecosystem. So that's how you got a bit of an idea about what an ecosystem function is. And the critical thing about ecosystem functions is that ecosystem functions are controlled by interactions among species. So the functions that an ecosystem produces controls are a product of the species that are present in the ecosystem and how well everything works. So let's have a look at one of these examples. So here we're going back into Yellowstone. These three graphs, we've got the number of wolves, here we've got the number of elk, and here we've got the abundance of tall willows. And here we have a sequence of photographs of the same stretch of river. And we can have a look about how wolves affect different ecosystem functions. So let's think about the functions we want to talk about. Well, Let's focus on, we've got a graph here on willows. So willows are a type of plant, but riparian vegetation. So we can think about the ecosystem function of production of plant biomass. But we can also think about other ecosystem functions. Things like bank stabilization for rivers. So that is, how wide does the river get, or is the bank really, really solid so you get these sort of more steep sides. We can also talk about shelter and forage production. Let's have a look at what's going on. So here we have years, and here we've got the number of wolves. And you can see there were lots and lots of wolves until the 1920s. All the wolves in Yellowstone were killed off. They got rid of all of them. And we had this big gap until 1996 when wolves were reintroduced. So a huge gap of time between the 1920s and the 1990s when there were no wolves. So let's have a look at that time. What did the river look like? So when there were no wolves, the river was really wide. It hasn't really got any steep banks at all. The banks look very unstable, they look like they're eroding. And there's very few plants on the side of these rivers. When we go to 1999, we have a bit more vegetation, and the river is becoming narrower. The banks are getting slightly more stable. Remember, it's only a few years after wolves have come back. Then if we go to 2003, we can see the river has totally changed. It's now much narrower. The banks look incredibly stable, and we've got lots of this riparian vegetation in the form of willows around the bank. So what's happening? Well, the wolves have gone away and then they come back. So what happened to the elk over that same time in the area? Well, the number of elk actually went down. But what happened to the willows? Well, the willows were really high when there was lots of wolves, and they dropped right down, and then when wolves were reintroduced, willows started returning. So the question is, what is going on? I mean, it doesn't look like the wolves are just killing all the elk, because the elk numbers actually went down while wolves were extirpated. So it's not that there's like large changes in elk, but we are getting big changes in willows. Well, what they think is happening, and we'll talk about a video about this at the end, is that wolves, like most predators, have a very, very impressive hunting strategy when it comes to water sources. So no matter what animal you are, you need to drink at some point. So many predators, rather than chasing animals around in the grasslands and just aimlessly wandering about, predators tend to hang around near water sources because they know that their prey have to come to the water to drink, and so it's much easier to just sit by the water, wait for your prey to come, than chase it around all over the place. What this means is that prey become fearful of water and don't want to spend much time near water. They want to just run in, drink, and get out again as quickly as they can. What this means is they stop eating the riparian vegetation. They stop eating the plants that are growing around the sides of water sources because they don't want to be near that water. Instead, they come in, drink, and run off. What that means is the plants are able to regrow around the riverbanks. The plants, their roots stabilize the banks and cause the stream to become much, much more stable. Okay? So even though wolves are not reducing the number of elk, they are changing the way in which elk are foraging, and that's having large consequences for ecosystem functions. Okay? Righty. Let's just talk a little bit how these things can go a bit squirrely though. So what we're going to do is talk about bottom-up trophic cascades. We talked previously about what we call top-down trophic cascades, where predators eat their prey a lot, and as a result, plants can go up. Now we're going to talk about bottom-up trophic cascades, where instead of coming down from the top, we're coming up from the bottom. So, here is a sort of normal lake food chain. So, we've got sediment at the bottom of the lake. We've got these nutrients that interact with the sediment. The nutrients are taken up by phytoplankton. The phytoplankton also use light. They combine the nutrients and this light to produce energy in their bodies. The phytoplankton are eaten by zooplankton, these little daphnia, and the zooplankton are eaten by whitefish. So this is the normal healthy trophic cascade, going bottom up. So, what happens if we add a load of extra nutrients into this system? So we add a load more nutrients, and now there's lots more nutrients floating around in the water. Well, because there's more nutrients, that means the phytoplankton can bloom. Because they take the light, they sequester, they use up these nutrients, and their populations increase an awful lot. Because the phytoplankton increase, the zooplankton also increase, because their food has now gone up. Because the zooplankton increase, the fish also increase, because they've now got a lot more food. So we've got this bottom-up trophic cascade, increased nutrients cause increased phytoplankton, increased zooplankton, increased whitefish. However, it can then start to get really rather complicated, because you can have the situation where these excess whitefish end up eating a lot more of their prey because there's a higher population of whitefish. Because the predators have eaten more zooplankton and driven them down, the phytoplankton are now released from the threat of consumption by the zooplankton. So we get a massive bloom in phytoplankton, and this is how we end up with what we call phytoplankton blooms. So things like this. This is a nice picture of Utah Lake. This is in a healthy year, so you can see it looks very inviting. There's a happy little dock with the canoe and the little paddle boats. And look at this water, lovely and clear. You can see the plants on the bottom. Nice, clear water, happy to go and swim around in. If you have excess nutrients entering this lake, that causes the bottom-up trophic cascade that we saw before, and the lake ends up getting a phytoplankton bloom and looking like this. So now we have this pretty nasty looking green slime all around the shores of the lake. I wouldn't be massively keen to jump in there and go swimming. This is all phytoplankton that has bloomed because excess nutrients get into the water. That produces more phytoplankton. More phytoplankton produces more zooplankton produces more fish eat the zooplankton, releasing the phytoplankton from predation, and so as a result you get these massive blooms. And this happens at Utah Lake very, very regularly. You've probably seen it in the news where they talk about eutrophication and algal blooms in Utah Lake. Although it didn't just happen in Utah Lake, there are some other incidences of this sort of thing taking place. And one of the ones that was really interesting was when it happened in the Great Salt Lake. So we can ask the question of what controls algae in the Great Salt Lake. So this picture was taken by Wayne Wurzbach, who is a retired faculty member from the Quinney College of Natural Resources, where I am. He took this picture in the giant algal blooms that occurred in 1984-1985 in Utah Lake, in Salt Lake rather. And this is literally a handful of algae he's scooped up out of the lake. This is not mud. This is phytoplankton and algae that has grown in Utah, in the Great Salt Lake. And Wayne had this idea that these big blooms in 1984-1985 could actually be related to the Great Flood that occurred in Salt Lake City in 1983. So for those of you, I mean, most of you I suspect weren't born in 1983, but this is what the flood in 1983 looked like. So here is State Street in downtown Salt Lake. There's the Capitol building at the top. And there was a gigantic flood that took place in all of this section of Utah, to the extent where they put sandbags down the sides of State Street to turn State Street into a gigantic drainage channel because the whole area was flooding. This massive flood of water, to the extent where they had to basically put flood control in the middle of Salt Lake City. So Wayne had this idea of saying, well, could these floods in 1983 be related to the big algal blooms in 1984 and 1985? So he started doing this project about what controls algae in the Great Salt Lake. And he collected these data. So on the x-axis we have the years, so 1973, 1985, 1986 to 1990. And we have a whole bunch of different metrics. So this is salinity of the lake, how salty it is. So in 1973 it was really salty. 1985 it was not very salty at all. 1986 to 1990, very, very salty indeed. He also measured a number of this little insect called a charixid. You've probably seen a charixid but might not have realised what you were looking at. These are the little water boatmen, the little swimming insects that you get in the lake. And what Wayne observed is that in 1973 there were none 1985, there were loads of these carixids. 1986 and 1990, there were none. Wayne also then measured the grazers, so these are the small animals that eat algae. And in 1983, so there was lots of grazers. 1985, there were also lots of grazers, but the species composition had changed. So this black bar is Artemia, or brine shrimp. And then we've got these other grazers like rotifers, Clito and Diapomus. You can see 1973 there was lots of Artemia. 1985 a lot less Artemia. When you got to 1986, loads of Artemia and a few rotifers. If you then look at the grazing rate, this is the rate at which these grazers are consuming algae. It was really high in 1973, very low 1985, very high again 1986, 1990. He also measured actual physical characteristics of the water and looked at chlorophyll A. So chlorophyll A is the amount of algae present. 1973, very little. 1985, an awful lot. This was that algal bloom in 1985. 1986, very little. He also measured the water transparency, very high in 73, very low in 85 because there was so much algae in there. Very high in 1986, 1990. And he also looked at nutrient levels. In 1973, there was a fair bit. 1985, a lot less. And just not really detected in 1986, 1990. So this is all the data that Wayne collected. He's got data on the salinity of the lake, chlorophyll, the amount of algae, the amount of animals, the grazing rates, and the physical characteristics. So the question then becomes, well, what caused the 1984-1985 algal blooms? Can we look at these data and ask ourselves, okay, what caused the algal bloom? Well, think about this as a clicker question. Was it A, increased nutrients, B, increased chlorophyll? Well, not really, because increased chlorophyll is by definition increased algae. C, presence of carixids, or D, can't tell. But I just gave one of them away. I'll give you 20 seconds on this one. Work through which of these things you think caused the algal blooms. Another 5 seconds. 2, 1. Righty, well, let's have a look, shall we? So, is it increased nutrients? The algae need nutrients to grow, so in theory, increased nutrients could be the cause of the blooms. Let's have a look. Remember, the bloom was in 1985, but in 1973, there was a lot more nutrients present than there were in 1985. So if we think it's getting caused by algal blooms, by increased nutrients, we would expect to see more algae in 1973 and 1985, and that's just not what we see. We see a lot less algae in 1973 than we see in 1985. So it's not increased nutrients. Is it increased chlorophyll? Well, chlorophyll is algae, so technically they are related, but it's not really causing it, is it? You don't say there's more of this because there's more of this. It doesn't make sense. D, can't tell. Well, we can really. So let's have a look at C. Presence of carixids. So look at these things. Here is the carixid sitting here. It's an insect that only occurred in 1985. So what does a carixid do? Well, this is a carixid, in case you haven't seen one before. They're these little back swimmers. Now, carixids are insects, and insects aren't very good at dealing with salty water. So, in the years 1985, remember we'd had this massive flood in the years previous that had lowered the salinity in the lake to lower than this level, just under 100 grams per litre. This 100 grams per litre is the point at which insects can survive in the lake. So the salinity dropped down. As a result, we get these carixids. Now these carixids are a predator, and they eat the animals that are beneath them in the food chain. And they're particularly good at eating Artemia. This is Artemia, which is a brine shrimp. Brine shrimp are a type of animal called a branchiopod. And if you go back 300 million or a couple of 100 million years in the fossil record, these species are incredibly common all over the world, doing a whole bunch of different jobs. However, they're very good at living in high salt water, but they're very bad at dealing with predators. So when you have a predator, like a Caryxid, come in, it massively reduces the diversity of Artemia. So they go from up here down to here. And we get these other grazers coming in instead. Now these Artemia are really good at grazing. They're very, very good at harvesting algae. You can see how much algae is getting harvested in this year compared to this year. So what happens is the Caryxids are able to enter the lake because the salinity has dropped. Because the Caryxids come in, they eat a whole bunch of these very highly efficient grazers. That massively reduces the grazing rate. That reduced grazing rate causes a big increase in our algae and we get an algal bloom. So you can see how these ecosystem functions, ecosystem processes become very complicated, and it becomes a little bit of detective work to figure out what happened where. Okay. So let's have another look at another one. So now we're going to talk about another local ecosystem, Yellowstone. So this is a map of Yellowstone and the surrounding area. So Yellowstone National Park is sitting here, and we're looking at the different elk herds. There are multiple different elk herds that utilise Yellowstone National Park. It's not like there's one group of elk that just live there, because elk are migratory. So we've got 4 basic elk herds that use Yellowstone National Park, which are the Northern Herd, Clark's Fort, Cody and Jackson. And what's been happening to these elk herds over the last few years is they've been declining, unfortunately. You can see this most in the calf-cow ratio. So a high calf-cow ratio means that every female elk is producing a lot of calves. A low calf-cow ratio means that very few females are producing calves, and as a result you're getting lower populations. So we're getting a reduction in the rate of reproduction of these elk, and the population is going down. So we can look then at the trophic cascades caused with the introduction of wolves and the reduction of these elk. So let's have a look. This is the wolf population. We've got time along the bottom. Remember, wolves were reintroduced in 1996. And the population of Yellowstone's wolves has increased since then and now pretty much stabilised and started to move around. If we look at what else is happening, well, over that same time period, here's when willow was present in the park, but following the reintroduction of wolves, we got this big increase in the amount of willows. We also have a big increase in the height of aspen following wolves. And we've got a big increase in the amount of cottonwood. So we've got this wolves getting introduced, we're observing a bit of a decrease in elk, and we're observing an increase in all of these plants. But we're also observing an increase in the amount of beaver. So why would you be increasing beaver in response to wolves? Well, we now have all these new plants. We've got cottonwood and willow and aspen, these plants that beaver like to eat and needs to produce their dams and lodges. So as a result, wolves has been moving grazing by elk away from the rivers. That's allowing these plants to grow, and as a result we're seeing increased amount of beaver. We're also seeing increased amounts of bison. Although wolves will eat bison, they're a bit of a challenge for them, let's be honest. And so as a result, the reduction of grazing by reduction of access to grazing areas for elk is increasing the amount of bison. So it's having all these sorts of effects. I could walk through this a million times and talk to you about different types of way of going, but instead let's watch this YouTube video. This YouTube video is up online, obviously. It's worth clicking it yourself after this just to have a look so you can see it in better quality. Because I sat there and thought, well, I could talk about this and walk through the different processes that take place, but instead we'll have another English person with an even sillier accent do it instead. So give me a second, I will just share the next part. It's in here, I think. Let's make this full size. And away we go.
exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed. More pools formed. More riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Okay, so that's about as far as I wanted to get up to today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. All the best.